But as someone who's on a starship, you must understand how complicated technology can be.
The Wi-Fi gets a little shoddy when I go through the nebula.
Yeah, those nebulas, man, always getting in the way.
That's right.
All right. Looks like that is up and running. Excellent. Okay.
Good night. Bye.
Hi, Jose. How are you doing?
Okay. Wait for Gina. Gina is coming soon.
Okay. Well, we'll give it a minute for people to log in through Zoom or through the YouTube stream, and then we'll get down to work. And that is, there we go.
Rabbi, quick question. So for the live streaming, it's just your shared screen and your video, correct? Or am I also?
Nope. I always set it so that it is just me, because I know some people are not eager to be on YouTube as their as a video.
Sure.
Every now and then it might glitch, so I can't guarantee it, but I do always set it as a pin spotlight on my camera, and then the main screen that's being shared, like you said. But of course, people can't hear anyone else participating in the Zoom.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah, I figured out very early on under the COVID conditions that a lot of people don't like being on video. And I respect that. All right, that is our usual 2-minute warning. And unlike the 2-minute warning at the Super Bowl, this is going to be a real 2 minutes, which means we're going to get down to work. And Jose, Regina can join us when she's here. And if she needs to catch up with the YouTube to review, that's perfectly fine. And as always, for not just you, but for anyone, if people have questions, they are always welcome to either ask them during the class or even after the class too. So we are beginning chapter 7 tonight of Mishnah Chullin, and we are continuing with kashrut because that is the dominant theme of this Masechet, of this section of Mishnah. And this section is a totally new topic for the Mishnah. It's one that might sound a little familiar. The other topics that we have been wrestling with of how to slaughter and the draining of blood, there are some biblical references to it, but none that most people remember. No offense, if you remember the idea that the Mishnah, the Torah tells us to drain the blood of animals, that is wonderful and yasher koach. But a lot of people focus on the narrative more than the legal sections. But tonight we get both. We get both narration as well as legal requirement. And that is because chapter 7 deals with what is called Gid HaNashe, or as often is described as the special section of thigh muscle, which gets identified with the sciatic nerve. And that is because of the text of Genesis 32:33, which I have conveniently brought up here in our discussion, which is taken from the story, the story of Jacob when he is wrestling with a malach, with an angel. And in the process of the wrestling, his thigh is wrenched, it is twisted. And as it says at the end of the chapter, that is why the children of Israel, that's us, to this day, do not eat the thigh muscle, the Gid HaNashe. That is on the socket of the hip, or literally on the spoon of the hip, since Jacob's hip socket was wrenched at the thigh muscle. And that is a summary of what happened in the struggle when we go back here to verse 26, where they are wrestling until the break of dawn. And when he saw that he had not prevailed against him, which, although the pronouns sometimes make it a little unclear, is generally understood to be the malach, the angel against Jacob, he, meaning the angel, wrenched him at his hip socket, so that the socket of his hip was strained as he wrestled with him. And so from that story, we have the prohibition on this set of tissue, this set of muscle and nerve that is found along the thigh. However, those of you who have been studying Mishnah with me for a while will immediately say, well, wait a minute, Rabbi, does that mean the whole thigh is off limit or only part of the thigh is off limit? What's going on here? And that is going to be our topic for today. I do have a diagram, which we'll be looking at a little bit later, but let's go ahead and get some of the text of the Mishnah on our table for discussion so that the diagram will make more sense. So we begin with the second paragraph from Rabbi Kolp's translation. And of course, remembering again, the bold is his translation, the not bold is his explanation. The prohibition of the sciatic nerve, the Gid HaNashe, is in force, meaning it's required, both within the land and outside it, meaning whether you live in Israel or don't live in Israel, both during the existence of the temple and after it, when the temple stood or when it didn't, in respect of both unconsecrated and consecrated animals. It applies to cattle and to wild animals, to the right and left hip. All right, so there's a lot of different details in there that are all very, very important. So one thing that's important is that right and left, even though we know that the angel only wrenched one hip, we don't have a specific tradition of which hip it was. And we also don't see a limitation in the commandment in the Torah of only being one hip. Therefore, we don't eat from the tissue from either hip. That means both parts of the animal have to be dissected in order for this portion to be removed if we are going to eat from that area. It applies to cattle and wild animals, again, because there was nothing that described the distinction between domesticated and non-domesticated. It applies to both unconsecrated and consecrated, whether we are planning to eat it or whether it is planning to be offered on the altar. It still must be respected. And it is whether the temple stands or doesn't, and whether we live in Israel or not. That is why here in the United States of America, we still have to remove the sciatic nerve, or as I talked about in my Pathway to Judaism class on kashrut, is more common to simply not eat anything from that portion of the animal and sell it to other butchers, non-Jewish butchers, for their use. All right. However, part 3, it does not apply to a bird because it doesn't have a socket on its hip. Now, this is where we're going to go to our diagram. And the diagram is probably going to give you more information than we need right now. But as you can tell, we are looking at the back half of a cow here. And as you can also tell, that our spoon of the thigh is talking about that upper thigh bone that is socketed in the hip. Now, if you have ever butchered a cow, it would look a lot like this. However, I'm willing to guess that most of you have never butchered a cow. But I am willing to put money on that most of you have eaten a roast chicken. Most of you have had a chicken, and you have had a leg, and you have seen the leg and the thigh together. If you haven't and didn't notice that you were dissecting the chicken when you were having dinner, well, pay more attention next time. If you do so, you will notice that the way the thigh bone is shaped on a chicken is not the same as the more deeply socketed bone in the mammal. And as such, there isn't that same spooning, if you will, as used in the idiom from Bereshit, from Genesis. Because the chicken lacks that anatomy, or any poultry lack that anatomy, we don't have to worry about removing any of the muscle tissue from birds. So this is why you can have a full intact chicken and roast it up for Shabbat, and it is so nice, and you don't have to worry about this mitzvah. But it's why you do need to worry about a cow or a sheep or any other kind of mammal that you are serving up. And there's lots of other things to worry about, which is what the whole rest of this section of Mishnah is about. But for today, we're going to focus on this. Now you can see that in this area, this region of the animal, is where the Gid HaNashe, the sciatic nerve, comes down, and the tendons and tissues that all guide it in and goes all the way down through the leg. So you can also begin to imagine, if you are a butcher, removing that is a bit of a pain. It is extremely difficult. Again, as I mentioned earlier in my Pathway to Judaism class on kashrut, this is the main reason why most modern butchers, especially here in America, don't bother trying to remove it. They just cut off the back of the cow and they sell it to a non-Jewish butcher so that it can be properly slaughtered for non-Jewish customers who are not bound by this mitzvah, because it's literally not worth their time and effort. Now, in other parts of the world, and certainly throughout our history, that was not always an option. And the waste of the back half of the animal would be impossible, unimaginable. So for most of the last 2,000 to 3,000 years, depending upon which community we're talking about, the butcher would get down and would work diligently to remove this tissue in order that the rest of the meat could be preserved and eaten. All right, before I flip off the picture, back to the main text of the Mishnah, are there any questions about the diagram? Everyone's got the general vicinity laid out? Okay, so we move down to paragraph 4 from this translation. It applies to a fetus. Rabbi Yehuda says it does not apply a fetus, and its forbidden fat is permitted. Now, this is a continuation of the discussion that we have had before about a fetus that was inside the mother, that when the mother was slaughtered, the fetus is now considered to have been slaughtered as well. And the question is, well, okay, I understand the fetus has been slaughtered, but is the sciatic nerve of the fetus allowed or not? Is only the sciatic tissue of the mother considered prohibited, or is the sciatic tissue of the fetus also considered prohibited? Because it's not really a leg, because the thing was never born. And the answer that is given by the dominant position, the unnamed position of the Mishnah, is that indeed this mitzvah applies to the fetus, and a fetus would still need to have this part of its tissue removed before it could be eaten from. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees and says that no, the fetus is part of the mother, and it doesn't count as a leg. Indeed, even the fats on the fetus don't count as the normal prohibited fats, and the fetus is just treated like another bundle of tissue. Rabbi Yehuda loses this argument, but of course his opinion is preserved as part of the discussion. Moving on to part 5, we get a very interesting glimpse into the world of realia. Butchers are not trustworthy with regard to the removal of the sciatic nerve. The words of Rabbi Meir, meaning that's Rabbi Meir's opinion. The sages say they are trustworthy with regard to it, as well as with regard to the forbidden fat. So the argument here is, if I buy the back leg of a cow and the butcher says, oh, yeah, I've removed the sciatic nerve, no problem, don't worry, I've taken care of it, do I trust him? Or do I have to begin my own examination? Or would I rather do it myself and say, no, any leg I buy from you, leave intact, and I will remove it so I can see it with my own eyes? The sages say, no, if the butcher says they removed it, along with removing the forbidden fats, as well as one of the other requirements of making an animal kosher for consumption, we trust them, that we trust that they did it correctly and that they did as they claim to have done. Now, why might we not trust the butcher? Because it's a pain. Like I mentioned earlier, this is a very laborious process. This is like giving the cow an autopsy in its back legs. This is not an easy process. It is not just chopping up big chunks and sawing through bone. It is a delicate process to remove all that must be removed and to leave all that must be left behind. Because, of course, you don't want to throw away any parts of meat that could be actually used for proper eating. Because up until the modern world, people did not get meat all that often. And when they did, they wanted to eat everything that was kosher and permitted. Yes, Aaron.
Rabbi, previously, didn't we learn that if the butcher gives it to you, you can presume it's kosher as long as he's Jewish?
We did. And indeed, that's the position that the Chachamim, the sages, are taking here. But Rabbi Meir is saying there's an exception with regard to the Gid HaNashe because of the great difficulty that we suspect that the butchers may not have done their due diligence with regards to that. But he is overruled by the majority, who say that indeed we can trust a butcher. Indeed, and as long as we have no reason to doubt, we can trust not only a butcher, but can even trust our neighbor. As long as no reason to believe they don't know what they're doing, then we are fine. Now, this is a remarkable example, one that we get many different examples of, not only here in Chullin, but in many other parts of the Talmud and Jewish law, that the rules of kashrut are meant to establish trust. They are meant to establish a shared faith community and a shared faith in the table. Unfortunately, over the last couple hundred years, for a whole host of community, social, psychological, political, and many other reasons, that ground of trust has become more shaky. Some have given lots of reasons for mistrust. Many have gone so far as to say that keeping kosher is totally unimportant, and they are very public about disregarding it. And many others have said, I don't trust anyone outside my community to do it, even if the people that they are mistrusting have clearly shown their commitment to keeping kosher. This is a major issue contemporarily in not only America, where there's competition among different supervising agencies, but especially in Israel right now, where legislation to open up the supervision process to non-government run supervisors, but others who are equally qualified to provide kosher supervision, is causing a great deal of argumentation within that country. Like many things, once it reaches a level of politics, religion is really a quite low concern for many of the people involved. For many of them, it's more about the economics of the situation. And that is a shame, but as we can see by this paragraph, it's not unusual. We've been worried about the economics of kashrut for as long as we've had kashrut. And that's not going to go away, but we should look towards trust as being our benchmark and only walk back that trust for really legitimate religious reasons, where a person has said, I don't keep kosher, I don't care about keeping kosher. Then yes, we can walk back the way we would trust them to prepare food for us. But it should never be an issue of politics or economics. It simply tears apart what kashrut is meant to do, which is to build a shared sacred community where food is a symbol, a bridge of that community and trust within it. But this is not only a lifelong challenge, this is a generation to generation challenge. Yes, Aaron.
Two more questions. If you didn't trust the person, how would you know if the sciatic nerve was removed or not? I mean, it would be hard to verify if it was already filleted, right?
Correct. And then you wouldn't buy from them. You would only buy from them if you bought the leg portion undisturbed, so that you could remove it to your satisfaction.
And the other question back to the politics that you were talking about before. There was a Mishnah on this with Shammai, the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel, where they both ate at the same table. Was there any commentary on when people are politicizing it that have to do with that?
Oh, absolutely. Unfortunately or fortunately, depending upon your politics, there are pages and pages of commentary that explain exactly as I just said, that even where you disagree and take a slightly more stringent or lenient view than someone else, that unless there is an actual violation, not mere stringency versus leniency, but an actual violation, that you should still be willing to eat at their table for the sake of peace, for the sake of keeping the community together. There's a specific example with regards to the baking of bread by certain stringencies that Rabbi Joseph Caro brings in Shulchan Aruch that uses that exact words, that we need to recognize that my stringency voluntarily taken on doesn't impose that stringency on someone else. And also, I should also be willing to eat with them, provided everything else is kosher within the normal standard, for the sake of peace. I shouldn't say, I can't eat a Jew because you don't follow such and such stringency. This is also very important when it comes time for Passover, for Pesach, where many Ashkenazic Jews will still refuse to eat anything that is from kitniot, generally defined as legumes, beans, and types. But their Sephardic neighbors have no problem eating those foods because that's not a stringency of their community. And the question always comes up, can an Ashkenazic Jew eat in a Sephardic Jew's house during Passover? And the answer is a very resounding yes, that the Ashkenazic Jew might still avoid eating the kitniot, the bean dishes. They can recognize that those dishes do not invalidate everything else at the table, and everything else is perfectly permitted. So there are always ways, if we are willing to be reasonable and caring about each other, to find common ground. Yes, if somebody has completely renounced kashrut and says, I love eating bacon and ham cheese sandwiches, that makes it very problem for me to willingly accept a roast beef sandwich that they offer me. On the other hand, if I know the person keeps kosher, even if I'm not sure they keep it with all of the stringencies that I try to keep, I will usually err on the side of trust that if they keep kosher, I will eat what they are serving me.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Sorry, one last thing. This problem has even risen to the extent that some kids don't eat with their parents, right?
Unfortunately, that has become a common issue. For a certain type of young person, well, and then eventually older, who choose to take on new stringencies for themselves. And I'm not talking about going from non-kosher to keeping kosher. That, yes, sometimes if you're moving from non-kosher to keeping kosher, it will take a lot of effort to be able to continue to eat the food at your parents' house. If you have that issue, talk to me. There are ways to make it happen, mostly by you, the person demanding that they keep kosher, doing a lot of work to help them make their house suitable. But even for people that come from a kosher home who choose to add additional stringencies, sometimes they have refused to then eat at their parents' home anymore, which is actually a violation of the mitzvah of honoring your parents. But again, this is usually more of a social political issue rather than religious, with the communities that are encouraging them from breaking off from their families, doing so primarily so that they will become more dependent upon the community rather than their families. But that's a much less joyful thing to discuss than the laws of kashrut themselves. Because, like I said, eating is supposed to be a pleasurable experience in Judaism. All right, Mishnah number 2. One may send to a non-Jew a thigh in which the sciatic nerve has not been removed because its place is well known. So what is this talking about? It means that if I'm going to transmit transmit, that's the wrong word. If I'm going to deliver a piece of meat with a non-Jewish courier, that is perfectly fine, even though I haven't taken out the sciatic nerve, because the Jew will open up the meat, see that it hasn't been removed, and will then remove it. There is no issue. Additionally, some argue that this is saying that I could even sell this through a non-Jewish middleman and not worry that there will be an issue. Because again, the Jewish customer will open up the meat, see that it hasn't been removed, and know to remove it before the food can be kosher. When a person removes the sciatic nerve, he must remove all of it. Rabbi Yehuda says, only so much as is necessary to fulfill the mitzvah of removing it. Now, there's a bit of a debate here, and again, the Talmud will go into much more detail, but that's not for tonight, about exactly how much needs to be removed. How far down the tissue strands do you have to go? In general, the rule is to remove all of it and any surrounding tissue that has to be removed in order to ensure that you have removed all of it. That is to say, there is a more maximal default position on the removal here. Rabbi Yehuda, on the other hand, says, no, there is the minimum that needs to be removed, scraped away if you was, or not scraped away, but just removed, but you don't have to damage the additional tissue around it as a precaution. So this is a debate. However, what eventually ends up being the resolution, as we'll see later on, I think I might be confusing my Talmud review with the Mishnah review, is that the majority of the sciatic nerve is, of course, forbidden by Torah law, but the ancillary sections is forbidden by rabbinic enactment. So there are 2 degrees, both are forbidden, but of course the punishment is a little different, which is what we will be seeing in Mishnah 3. If a person ate an olive's bulk of the sciatic nerve, he incurs 40 stripes. Like with so many food prohibitions, says Rabbi Kolb, you have to actually eat a kazait, like an olive's amount of the material, before you can be considered to have violated the commandment. This doesn't mean that you should deliberately eat less. It just means that there is a minimum threshold for actual consumption. Eating means eating this much. And if you eat that much, then indeed you are flogged for the violation of that commandment. If he ate all of it, and it was not as much as an olive's bulk, he is liable. So if it was a very, very, very small animal, and the totality of the sciatic nerve was altogether less than an olive's bulk, but you ate it anyway, but you ate all of it, meaning you consumed the entirety of what was in that animal, you are still liable as well. That is still a violation, even though you didn't meet the minimum measure, because you ate it. So we're looking at 2 different definitions. One is, did you eat? And the other is, did you eat it? If you ate, meaning a minimum of an olive's amount, then you would be punished. If you ate it, meaning all of it, regardless of the amount, then likewise you would be punished. That makes sense? Not seeing any questions or unmuting. Good. If he ate an olive's bulk of it from one thigh and an olive's bulk of it from the other thigh, he incurs 80 stripes. Rabbi Yehuda says he incurs only 40 stripes. So the first opinion, well, if you would like to know the terminology, the Tanna Kama says that the prohibition is on the sciatic nerve. Therefore, if you eat 2 of them, you are liable for twice the punishment. Just like if you steal twice, you are liable for twice the punishment because of the stealing. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, if you ate, and that's all that matters. If it doesn't matter, this one versus that one, and you only receive 1 punishment. Of course, Rabbi Yehuda is in the minority on that position. How are we doing? All right, on to Mishnah 4. On to Mishnah 4. If a thigh was cooked together with the sciatic nerve, and there was enough of the nerve to impart a flavor, meaning to the rest of the meat, it is forbidden. How does one measure this? As if it were meat cooked with turnips. All right, you're probably not all big turnip fans out there. I'm not, but I will try to explain what this is talking about. Actually, daikon is very nice. That's that's actually a type of radish, isn't it? Turnip? Okay, I'm not a gardener. Anyway, let's get back to the main topic. This is introducing a principle that is going to become more familiar over time, but there is a general prohibition on the eating of forbidden with permitted food based around the ta'am, the flavor that comes from the forbidden food. Here what we are seeing is, imagine somebody has cut the thigh and they haven't removed the gid hanashe, and they put it in the oven, they roast it up, and then they take it out and they go, oh no, I forgot to remove the gid hanashe. Am I allowed to eat this piece of meat or am I not? And that's the question that we're dealing with. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute. Are you allowed to eat the gid hanashe? No. You still have to remove the gid hanashe, but the question then becomes, the whole thigh was cooking together with the forbidden food, this tissue. Doesn't that invalidate the rest of the food? Or because it is so small, because it is just, one little line of tissue running down the leg, maybe it's not a problem. And, it's completely nullified by the food itself, by the rest of the meat. The benchmark is, and again, this will be a familiar benchmark, so go ahead and ask questions tonight, but we will review this again for other topics. If it gives a flavor, then the rest of the meat is forbidden. If it doesn't have enough to give a flavor to the rest of the meat, then the rest of the meat is permitted. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, hold on, how do I tell if the meat is being flavored by another part of meat? Because it's like meat, right? It's if you remove the nerve and you don't remove the nerve, I defy anyone to be able to tell the difference when you are actually eating the leftover meat. It's simply impossible to tell the difference. Now, when we get on later on to talk about the flavor that comes from a forbidden food or comes from the mixing of meat and milk, it's much more obvious, right? If you mix milk into a beef stew, there's a definite point at which point you'll be tasting the creaminess that comes from that milk. But meat plus meat, how am I going to tell that when it's the same exact animal? We're not even talking about mixing between a cow and sheep. We're talking literally the same animal. And that's where our turnip comes in. And the question then is, was there enough of the gid hanashe, enough material there that had it been cooking with a turnip, the turnip would have tasted like meat? That's what they mean by as if the meat were cooked with turnips. The turnip is the literal litmus test, like litmus paper. And so we say, well, there were 2 ounces of gid hanashe, and if we were to cook a turnip with that, the turnip would still just taste like a turnip. Then you remove that tissue from the thigh, and the rest of the thigh is considered permitted. On the other hand, if it was a big animal and it's a lot of gid hanashe material, and you say, look, if you cooked a turnip with that, it's going to taste very meaty, then the whole rest of that thigh would be thrown out. Questions or comments on that basic principle so far? I'll scroll down so you can see the rest of Rabbi Kolp's explanation.
Hey, Rabbi, I have a question about the previous.
Oh, okay.
Is it every piece of sciatic nerve you eat, you get 40 lashes, or does it have to be one from the right and one from the left? I mean, to get it.
It's right and left. So, I mean, again, we can go back to our discussion before about if a person commits one transgression and one forgetfulness, or if it's, in 2 transgressions and 1 forgetfulness, or different levels of forgetfulness. We can talk about that when we go back and look in Kritot. But here what we're talking about is he ate one and then he ate a second one. And so that is, those are 2 separate problems and thus 2 separate punishments. But if he ate from one and then continued to eat from it and then finished it off all in one forgetfulness, then that's just one mistake. Now, if he eats a bunch of it and then says, boy, that gid hanashe was great, and now I'm going to eat more from the same, and then he says, boy, that was great, now I'm going to eat more from the same, then he is committing multiple acts of rebellious behavior. But in general, that's not what the rabbis were concerned with here. They're concerned more with the accidental consumption. All right, moving on to 7.5, where we are continuing our mixed cooking problems. A sciatic nerve which was cooked with other permitted nerves, right, because there are a lot of tissues down there, if it can still be recognized, then all the nerves are prohibited if the sciatic nerve imparts a flavor. Right, let's make sure we got that case before we get to the but. Right, you cook up a whole bunch of stringy bits of tissue. And again, I will remind you, for most of human history, meat was pricey and it was rare, and you ate everything you could. And in Judaism, that means everything that was at least kosher. So eating up all of this extra tissue, and you've got a big pile of it, and then you recognize, wait, that is the gid hanashe. What's that doing mixed in here? I thought I threw that out. then you have to say again, if the Gita Nashe would change the flavor of the other bits of tissue, then everything would be thrown out. If it couldn't, then it's not an issue. However, that's only if you can actually recognize it, tell which piece in that pile is the actual Gita Nashe. But if it can no longer be recognized, then they are all forbidden, because now you don't know which one is which. And you know it's in there, and you know you're not allowed to eat it. Therefore, you have to say all of them are forbidden rather than take your chances and eating one of them. Similar, and the broth is prohibited if the sciatic nerve imparts a flavor. The juicy drainings of all of this cooking is also prohibited when the flavor is added. Now, you might be asking yourself, but Rabbi, I thought from other classes and more from what we will get exposed to as we go further into the Mishnah, probably not tonight, I thought that there was an issue of if something was less than 1/60th of the volume of the other material, that it would be nullified, that it would be dissolved, if you will, in the mixture. And yes, that is a general principle of kashrut. However, with regards to the Gita Nashe, it is considered to be its own thing, its own substance, and therefore it doesn't bundle with the others to be counterbalanced, outweighed by their larger proportion. And so the Gita Nashe is always forbidden.
Why so special?
You mean why does the Gita Nashe have that special status?
Exactly. Why the rest of the rules that for everything else in food doesn't apply for that part of the body?
I think there are a couple of reasons for that. And we will see something similar when it comes to the forbidden fats, is that these parts are the specifically commanded to be removed parts. They are They are treated as distinct from the rest of the animal. And there was also a very practical reason, which is there was concern about people, the butchers again, including home butchers, not being careful with this. That saying, good enough, I'm sure I got most of it. And by making it something that couldn't be overlooked because it was now a small amount, it forced people, to be very careful in its removal. So I think for both the way the Torah describes it, as well as the practical reasons, they really felt that it needed to be treated as a special category. And likewise, they do also hint at what happens with other material, and this may blow a few gaskets, let's say. And so it is with a piece of nevela. Remember, nevela is an animal that died all on its own, or a piece of an unclean fish, meaning like, a lobster or catfish, fish that are not kosher. If it can, that was cooked together with other pieces of flesh or fish, if it can still be recognized, then all are prohibited if it imparts a flavor. But if it can no longer be recognized, then they are all forbidden. And the broth is prohibited if the sciatic nerve imparts a flavor. So these other things can be removed, and the rest of it can be still eaten if it is nullified, not nullified, but if it is still recognized and small enough that it is not given flavor. But it does still need to be removed. And if it cannot be removed because it is all mixed up, then because of the status of each of these things, then they are prohibited altogether. All right. 7:6. I think we've got a good shot at finishing chapter 7 tonight. Let's see what happens. Oh, stop rolling. All right. It applies, meaning the rule of the sciatic nerve applies to clean animals, but not to unclean. Rabbi Yehuda says, even to unclean animals. All right. What is the issue here? Well, the issue is, if there is an unclean animal, do you have to worry about the sciatic nerve? Now, well, no, because it's not kosher. Why am I worried about this? But you're not thinking like a rabbi. Like a rabbi, you would say, what happens if somebody eats non-kosher meat and also eats the sciatic nerve of that non-kosher animal? Are they liable for just eating non-kosher meat, or are they liable for eating non-kosher meat and for eating the sciatic nerve? Right? Is there one prohibition or two prohibitions when it comes to eating this portion of a non-kosher animal? And the answer for the majority is one prohibition, that the removal of the sciatic nerve is only commanded for kosher animals. And therefore, if a person eats a non-kosher animal, they absolutely transgressed the prohibition on eating from a non-kosher animal. But even if they ate the sciatic nerve of that non-kosher animal, they have not transgressed that separate mitzvah. As I have said in many other classes, kashrut is a bundle of different commandments. It's not just one. And knowing which ones are involved in each different case or infraction is an important part of embracing the entirety of the system. And in this case, an unclean animal does not demand the removal of the gid hanasheh, and the eating of it doesn't constitute a separate violation. However, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he's got a very good argument. Rabbi Yehuda says, was not the sciatic nerve prohibited from the time of the sons of Jacob? And at that time, unclean animals were still permitted to them? This is a logical thinking, right? Rabbi Yehuda is saying, wait a minute, back here in Genesis 32, where Jacob is having his fight and he's getting his leg torn and all of that, we didn't have the other laws of kashrut. We didn't have all of the other rules that would eventually come in the time of Moshe, of Moses. So that means when the Torah told us, don't eat sciatic nerve, it was talking about not eating the sciatic nerve of unclean animals too, because they were eating unclean animals at that time. On the contrary, say the sages, they replied, this law was ordained at Sinai, but it was written in its proper place. Hold on. What this is saying is that the law about gid hanasheh was not given to Jacob at that time. Verse 33 is out of order. Verse 33 occurs at Mount Sinai, and God tells you, or tells us, rather, told us, don't eat the gid hanasheh, because your ancestor Jacob once wrestled with an angel and was injured in this place. And as a commemoration of that activity, you, from this point forward, will no longer eat the gid hanasheh. Now, that may be startling to some people. What that implies is that Jacob himself may have eaten that tissue for the rest of his life, and so did the 12 tribes, and so did their kids all the way up until Moses' generation, at which point it was instituted as a prohibition from that point forward, as a commemoration of the act that happened to Jacob all those years before. Now, some of you might be familiar with a midrashic teaching that says that the Avot, our ancestors prior to Mount Sinai, kept all of the laws that are found in the Torah. Even though they didn't receive the Torah, because that needed to wait until Moses, that nonetheless they knew, intuited, were spiritually in tune with the eventual requirements of the Torah, and thus must have kept all of the laws prior to its giving. This Mishnah says no. This Mishnah says that is a great midrash, and that midrash indeed is an insightful way of trying to remind us that our ancestors prior to the Torah had a firm connection with God, which meant that in the essence of Torah, they were absolutely learned, and in the connection to God, they were every bit as strong as the people who would get the Torah later, and in many ways, of course, far superior. But that doesn't mean that they followed every single rule that is found in the Torah from Sinai onward. And this is only one example. For if they were to follow all the rules in the Torah prior to their giving, then that would mean Abraham had been avoiding the Gid HaNasheh because his grandson would later have this injury on his thigh. Indeed, it would mean Jacob had already been avoiding the Gid HaNasheh for all the years of his life prior to the actual wrestling match, and that he had somehow been avoiding eating that tissue in memory of an event that had not yet happened, which is a little problematic. There are also, of course, other problems with regards to Judah, meaning Jacob's son, and Tamar, and the Yibum, the Levirate marriage as it was handled there, the marrying of two sisters in their same lifetime concurrently with Jacob. There are many other examples of where the Avot did not keep Torah precisely the way it would be explained from Sinai onward. And what the majority sage opinion here is saying is that indeed, this particular law was not given to our people until Mount Sinai itself. And it was given in commemoration, but it was not given at the time of the actual injury that took place. All right, so that was a long way of trying to explain all of that. But I'll pause now if there are questions or comments, because this might be earth-shattering depending upon which midrash you are very attached to. Or it might be perfectly understandable and logical depending upon your feelings about other things. John, yes.
Yes, Rabbi. So I can't remember exactly which chapter or verse this is in, but I think it says somewhere in Jeremiah, the prophet, it's Hashem speaking in this, and he's referring to the generosity of his people as they are wandering through the desert to Sinai. And I sort of imagined, like, what exactly is that generosity? I thought maybe they had some sort of knowledge of perhaps what they might receive at Sinai, whether it was incomplete or so. I was wondering if you might be able to comment just on what that generosity might refer to, or if I'm thinking about that.
So
Thanks.
there are a couple of different ways to interpret that verse. The most general version is Jeremiah is often contrasting the generation of the wilderness with the generation of his time, the destruction of the first temple. And even though we know objectively that the generation of the Exodus wasn't perfect, what he is trying to say is that by contrast, the generation of his time is so much worse, meaning that the willingness, the faith, the eagerness with which they followed God into the wilderness is something that was to their credit. Even though they messed up, which Jeremiah is not dwelling on, we do have to respect the fact that they generously followed this guy Moses and this God out into the middle of nowhere with no food and very few provisions in the process. So that's sort of the more general definition of their generosity, their willingness, their eagerness to follow God. But there were also discussions of prior to the building of the Mishkan, which we're actually talking about in the Torah reading during these weeks, the people offered sacrifices during that time. Again, even though they didn't know when their livestock might be replenished and when they would arrive at this land of Israel, they were still willing to offer sacrifices because there was more flexible sacrificial rules at the time. Additionally, some people argue that because they had been told that they would eventually have rules regarding how they would slaughter their animals for food, that many people refused to eat meat until they got those rules at Mount Sinai. And so they went to a dairy vegetarian diet in the meantime. And this is used as an explanation for the custom of eating dairy on Shavuot, of saying again to God, if we didn't know the right way, we would be willing to live as a dairy vegetarian in order to make sure we didn't transgress your laws regarding kashrut. And that is one of the many explanations given for the eating of dairy at Shavuot. So all of those are possible explanations for Jeremiah's intent in that verse.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome. Other questions? Aaron, you got your hand up. Sorry, I didn't see it there.
Thanks. I was looking at this. It seems like the sages may have given a rebuttal to Judah's logic, but in the very beginning, didn't it say that they don't distinguish between the wild and the domestic animals, but they don't say why they're distinguishing between the clean and unclean with the sciatic nerves? And is there a double jeopardy principle here at all?
Let me try and tackle the double jeopardy first. I'm going back to my old political science classes. With the idea of being prosecuted for the same crime twice, I don't think so, because if I remember correctly, double jeopardy means you have to be prosecuted for the same crime twice, not for the same action, but defined as two separate crimes. The way somebody can be prosecuted under state law for violating a law and then also under federal law, even though they broke both laws simultaneously. It's just a question of who has the first crack at prosecution. So I don't think that's quite the same analogy here, because we have definitely seen in previous sections that it is absolutely possible, especially go back to Kritot, we did a whole one-upsmanship on this. It is possible to break multiple commandments with one action. And that's not considered wrong. It just means you need to be really careful about what you're doing to make sure you're not getting multiple infractions simultaneously. However, the first part of your question about why make a distinction between clean and unclean as opposed to wild and non-wild animals is, I think, a little bit more on target. And the answer is that the wild and domesticated are both permitted to be eaten. And therefore, when we are being given instructions about how we eat them, it applies equally to both of them. Whereas an unclean animal is not permitted to be eaten. And therefore, the instructions about how to eat from the Gid Hanashe or around the Gid Hanashe must not be applicable to them because they are not designated as food. We'll see this again, and we've seen it a couple times in previous chapters, that which is not kosher gets really close to the border and sometimes over the line of no longer being classified as food. At that point, it's just considered flesh. And at that point, the rules governing it are very different than the rules governing food. So unclean animals are simply not in the cookbook. And as such, the removal of the Gid Hanashe is not a step of preparing them for eating. There's a similar point that we'll get to a little bit later, which is that when it comes to not mixing meat and milk together, that only is violated if it is kosher meat mixed with milk from a kosher animal. If you eat non-kosher meat with non-kosher milk with it, you are in violation of eating non-kosher food, but you are not in violation of eating a mixture of meat and milk, because the meat and milk prohibition is only for when you are actually making food. And since those aren't proper food, you cannot violate the other aspect at the same time. Question, John?
Yes. One last question here, Rabbi. So I was looking in Breshit chapter 32, and Jacob is speaking about his sojourn with Laban. And he says, I have sojourned with Laban, but the word in Hebrew is garti, which the numerical value of that is 613. So it looks like in the footnotes, there's a comment from Rashi saying that basically the patriarch had observed the 613 divine commandments and had not learned from Laban's evil ways during that time. So I guess, is there sort of that possibility that maybe some great holy men or the patriarchs had ascertained some of the commandments or had followed them? It was just an interesting commentary that
Exactly, and that is one of the commentaries that gives rise to this idea that they observed all of the commandments. Likewise, when Abraham is entertaining the angels when they arrive, he serves them milk first and then meat. And again, the Midrash points out that he wouldn't have reversed the order because you have to wait after eating meat before having milk. but there was a certain logical incongruity with the idea that they would have kept all of the commandments. For indeed, many of the commandments were only ordained in later lifetimes, like this particular one, and also many of the commandments were only ordained later on at the time of the Sinai. In particular, there is no way that Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob, or indeed any of their descendants until Sinai, could have observed all of the commandments regarding the Mishkan, regarding the tabernacle, or regarding the sacrifices that were being offered only at the tabernacle or then later at Jerusalem. It simply hadn't been built. And as those are a large number of commandments, it would be hard for them to observe them, thus reducing the 613. On top of that, all of the commandments regarding the Kohanim, the descendants of Aaron, and as they being the only ones capable, again, they make up a large portion of commandments from the 613 total, could not have been observed until Aaron himself was made a Kohen, was made the high priest. So the idea of them observing the 613 commandments has to be understood more as a metaphor or an archetypical number of saying they were fully in obedience with God, that they were fully in keeping with God's ways. Now, those ways would have looked a little different because of the timeline that they were living through than what we would recognize as post-Sinai, but that doesn't mean that we should think of them as being diminished or somehow lesser in our eyes just because they didn't have the Torah. And so the Midrash is there to praise them, and it is there to extol them and to say, look at what they were able to do even without the Torah, which is absolutely incredible and, of course, revolutionary, which is why we were able to get to the Torah eventually. But we shouldn't read that Midrash as being too literal, because it ties us in knots that would simply make it impossible for us to fully accept the flow of the text and the narrative as we have received it in the Torah itself.
That makes perfect sense. Thank you, Rabbi.
Natan?
Yes, I'm sorry, Rabbi. I had problem with my Wi-Fi when you explained it. Why is that the rabbis had issues with the no kosher animal about the kashrut? If anyway you cannot eat it?
You mean with regards to the Gid HaNashe?
Yes.
Right. So they're not saying that they have a problem. They were saying, and that was just back here, they are saying that it's not a separate prohibition, that the prohibition on eating the Gid HaNashe only applies to animals that are in and of themselves kosher. And thus, if you are eating from a cow and you eat it, you have violated that commandment. What Rabbi Yehuda is saying is that if you eat from, as Rabbi Kolb points out, a donkey, and you eat the Gid HaNashe, the donkey's Gid HaNashe, that you have broken two commandments: not to eat from the unclean animal and to eat the sciatic nerve. And the rabbis are arguing that that can't be true, that the eating of the non-kosher animal is, the only prohibition that is involved, because we are only told to remove the sciatic nerve from something that we can eat, that we are permitted to eat. Therefore, it doesn't apply to a non-kosher animal. It's simply, we shouldn't be eating that animal altogether. Therefore, it doesn't really count as something that must be prepared properly either. Therefore, eating from it only incurs the one penalty for eating from a non-kosher animal. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, and look at that. We just ticked over the 1 hour mark and we perfectly finished chapter 7. And chapter 8, we're going to get to everybody's favorite topic, the mixing of meat and milk, or rather the prohibition on mixing meat and milk. So for those of you that find this fascinating, stand by for next week. For those of you who find that confusing, stand by for next week. For those of you who find it infuriating, stand by for next week. It should be a lot of fun to discuss this one. So chapter 8 will begin next Wednesday night. Thank you all for joining me for our study. It's, as always, been very tasty.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you for the sense of humor.
Thank you, Rabbi.
I
Good night.
try. I'm not a professional comedian, but I try.
Well, you make it look natural, Rabbi. It's wonderful.
Thank you. Take
Yeah,
care,
good
everyone.
night.
You take care. Have a good night. Thank you.
After so many years at Shurim, we are now already used to.
I'm not sure if
We
that's
got
good
them.
for you or not.
We got them.
If you're getting my sense of humor.